Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the third annual Hesburgh Lectures. Your program doesn't indicate that they're called the Hesburgh Lectures, and we're Father Ted here tonight, we couldn't use that term because he's insisted since we started this series that they be called something else. But all of us connected with them know that the purpose of establishing this lecture series is to honor our distinguished university president who will be with us tomorrow. Beyond that purpose, our endeavor has been to continue to stimulate interest in an increasingly neglected area of human concern, the area of civil rights. And what we have tried to do in the past two lectures, and what we hope to do with the lectures that the Honorable Sargent Shriver will give tonight and tomorrow, is again to focus attention on this area and to hopefully say to the country, there's a lot of unfinished business, as one of our former presidents used to say, that has to be accomplished in this area. In case you're concerned that all of the people up here on the stage are going to have something to say tonight, I should set that concern at ease right away. They are going to have something to say, but it'll be brief, I assure you, except for our lecturer, the Honorable Sargent Shriver. 2 years ago, as some of you may remember, we inaugurated this series with the Chief Justice of the United States, Earl Warren, who spoke about civil rights from the perspective of the judiciary. A year ago, our lecturer was Senator Philip A. Hart, who spoke about the congressional perspective on civil rights. This year, we're honored to have as our lecturer the Honorable Sargent Shriver, who has been involved in a variety of roles in the executive branch of government and intends to share with us some of his thoughts on executive leadership and the role of the executive in the whole area of civil rights and human rights in general. One addition, I think, that is obvious to some of you, but perhaps not to all of you, is that initially this series was sponsored by the Notre Dame Law School. This year it's co-sponsored by the newly established Center for Civil Rights in the law school. And jointly we are endeavoring to continue the series that we started 2 years ago. To welcome Mr. Shriver and those other guests of the university that are here tonight attending the Civil Rights Conference that's being held in conjunction with the lecture series, we're privileged to have the Chief Academic Officer of the university, our Provost, the Reverend James T. Burchell. Father Jim.
Thank you, Professor Beatty. Mr. Shriver, or here I should say Dr. Shriver, and other honored guests, members of the Notre Dame family and the South Bend community. I will be very brief in extending my welcome. Tomorrow night, Father Hesburgh will stand here to repeat the welcome and I think to state it even better than I. But to you, Mr. Shriver, I extend the welcome not to a stranger but to a member of the House, because you are an alumnus of our university. You hold the highest honor that the university can bestow, the Laetare Medal. You were even Patriot of the Year in one of those years when we had Patriots of the Years, joining a distinguished and very heterogeneous group, and have been a frequent visitor under different auspices to our campus. It is most appropriate that we welcome you back here tonight to speak on civil rights. Our university is dedicated to a man who forfeited all of his rights that others might have more than their rights. He is our Lord, And he goads us forward, reminding us that it is rather fruitless and absurd for us to extend gracious things to those who do not even have things which are theirs in justice. And so, shamed as we are at the lack of even this most basic of God's gifts in our world, and at our indolence in providing that basic gift, we listen alertly to you tonight, that we might better live up to him whose cross stands on our walls. And I know that you will speak to us under his blessing. A very warm welcome again.
Thank you, Father Birchall, for your kind words. As I indicated previously, we, for the first time this year, are having lectures that are jointly sponsored by the Law School and the Center for Civil Rights. The director of that center, the Center for Civil Rights that occupies some space in the Law School, is Howard A. Glickstein. Many of you know Howard. He's the organizer and director of this conference, among other things. Howard had an extensive amount of experience with the federal government, culminated by his service as staff director to the Civil Rights Commission before coming here to Notre Dame last fall. It's an honor to present to you the director of the Center for Civil Rights, Howard Glickstein.
Good evening, Mr. Shriver, Father Birchall, Judge Motley, Professor Beatty, ladies and gentlemen. I have a great privilege this evening. I have the privilege of introducing to you a friend of mine for many, many years. I'm going to introduce Judge Constance Baker Motley, who I met, I think it was in 1961, in a courtroom in Jackson, Mississippi, when Judge Mize used to call her Attorney Motley. He wouldn't say Mrs. Motley, but Attorney Motley. Judge Motley joined the NAACP Legal Defense Fund immediately after her graduation from Columbia Law School, and was a member of the staff of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund at the time of the Brown case and worked on the brief in that case. Among her many, many distinguished legal activities was her representation of James Meredith at the time he sought admission and finally succeeded in being admitted to the University of Mississippi. As Professor Beatty indicated to you, the lectures that we've had the last 2 years and this year are covering a trilogy. We dealt with the judiciary 2 years ago, the legislative branch last year, and this year with the executive. Judge Motley incorporates into one person the experiences in each of these branches of government. She was elected to the New York State Legislature in 1964, where she was a state senator. In 1965, she became the borough president of the borough of Manhattan, the first woman to ever be elected to that position, and I believe the only woman that's ever held that position. And in 1966, she was appointed by President Johnson to the federal judiciary. At the time that Judge Motley was appointed federal judge, the New York Times carried an article that said the following: "There was a great and general sigh of relief yesterday. Constance Baker Motley, a single-minded woman, has been selected as a federal judge, and the hope was that the government boat she has been rocking since she became Manhattan Borough President would sail calmer waters." It's a great pleasure for me to present to you a single-minded woman who I hope will continue for many, many years to rock the boat from her position in the federal judiciary. Honorable Judge Constance Baker Motley.
Thank you very much, Howard. After the Brown decision, the 20th anniversary of which we note tonight, this nation faced a major leadership crisis. And that crisis was faced at the highest levels of government. The South had threatened to defy the Supreme Court and to resist the implementation of the Brown decision. If this nation was not to be torn asunder during the turbulent years which followed, our national leaders had to respond with courageous leadership in the ensuing struggle to implement that decision. Sargent Shriver comes to us tonight with an exceptional record of executive leadership on both the national and local levels in the years which followed the Brown decision. He has held responsible and challenging executive positions on the local and national level, in the private sector, as well as the national and international arena. At the highest levels of government, Mr. Shriver has demonstrated his leadership qualities. He was the first director of the Office of Economic Opportunity, a position which daily tested his executive skills. He also was the first director of the Peace Corps, where he demonstrated a leadership capacity unmatched in recent history. We only need look at the dedication of the persons who served under Mr. Shriver in the Peace Corps to see the strength of the inspiration and leadership which are characteristic of his public achievements. At the local level, Sargent Shriver has had experience in handling educational and racial problems. As past president of the Chicago Board of Education and former director of the Catholic Interracial Council of Chicago, he has confronted the day-to-day problems of schools and minorities in an urban setting. Many of the same problems which some of you here tonight have faced in your everyday participation in the struggle for equality. Mr. Shriver's activities on the international scene include his service as United States Ambassador to France and his position as director of the Chicago Council of Foreign Relations. His list of honorary degrees includes such schools as Notre Dame, Yale, Brandeis, and Morehouse. In 1968, Notre Dame awarded him the Laetare Medal, generally regarded as the most significant annual award given to Catholics in the United States. Presently, he is practicing law in Washington, D.C., and remains involved in numerous public activities. Mr. Shriver's record of leadership and his able insight into the problems of the government at the executive level make him eminently qualified to deliver Notre Dame's third annual Civil Rights Lectures. His philosophy of government leadership was expressed in September 1972 when he said, "We have always understood that the task of government was not to direct the people either by deception or by order, but to liberate the energies and talent of individuals in every community and neighborhood so they might lead themselves, and in doing so, guide the country. I am pleased to present to you Sargent Shriver.
Thank you very much, Judge Motley, Father Burchell, the Provost of Notre Dame, Director Glickstein, Frank Beatty, and ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to say that I'm not at all accustomed to giving lectures. I've sometimes given a number of talks, but I don't remember giving a lecture before. And therefore I was somewhat nervous before even coming here. But tonight I feel much more relaxed. I almost didn't make it, in fact. That's why I'm happy to be here. I almost didn't make it because of the energy crisis. It's a long way from Washington to South Bend at 50 miles an hour. And it's a little scary if you're going in a Boeing 727. Everybody down in Washington, despite the alleged lifting of the embargo, is still talking about the energy crisis. A few mornings ago, I was having breakfast with my children, one of whom's named Mark. He's just 10. And I asked him when he first noticed that there was an energy crisis, that the country was running out of energy. And he, quick as a flash, said about halfway through the McGovern campaign. The moral of that story, for those of you who are old enough to have them, is don't eat breakfast with your children. However, I know that this is a nonpartisan gathering, and I do wish to give President Nixon credit for recognizing the crisis before anyone else. It was over a year ago, I believe, to conserve energy, he was turning off his tape recorder. And even today, it is said in Washington that when he calls in his secretary, he just says, "Rosemary, take a hum." So, I do feel, as Father Burchell said, very much at home in Notre Dame. Between coming out here to speak on occasion for John Bradamus, the congressman, and to have the honor of receiving various awards from this university, which have always been treasured experiences for me, and between talking to Father Hesburgh and coming here occasionally at his request, I believe actually that I've been here so many times that it was no surprise to me when one morning during the campaign my wife turned to me and says, "Sarge, if you ever become president, trade in that house in San Clemente for one in South Bend." As I said before, I have been worried about giving this lecture or lectures. I've approached this opportunity with humility and misgiving. Misgiving because there are many others much more qualified by experience and erudition, and humility because of the great jurist who inaugurated this lecture series only 2 years ago, the former Chief Justice Earl Warren. Certainly not Martin Luther King, nor John Kennedy, nor Lyndon Johnson surpasses Earl Warren in his preeminent place in the history of civil rights in the United States. To be associated, even as a successor lecturer, with such an historic figure is an honor. But it's an honor that brings heavy responsibilities to maintain the quality of these lectures. And of that burden I am acutely conscious as I speak to you this evening. I'm especially conscious of it because I have been advised that I should give a lecture which could easily be published in the Notre Dame Law School Law Review, and therefore should be replete with scholarly citations and footnotes and references all the way back to the early origin of these matters in the English common law and civil law. But at the same time, I was to be diverting and anecdotal so as not to completely bore the audience. You will find out as we get along in this talk that I fear that I will be successful in neither of those missions. But I'm happy, though, to be here at this place and at this time for a number of reasons. One is the reason already alluded to, that it was just 20 years ago, this year, that Earl Warren gave the historic ruling for a unanimous Supreme Court in the Brown case, stating that equality before the law outlaws segregation in the schools, and that the bitter heritage of slavery should not enslave yet another generation. And I like the place. First, because your president, in whose honor these lectures are held, has lived in the cause of civil rights the full measure of a Christian vocation. He has been an advisor to the nation and has made God's work here on earth truly his own. I have a number of other things I want to tell you about Father Hesburgh, but I understand he's going to be here tomorrow night, and I'm saving some of the juicier remarks for then. It is also fitting that these civil rights lectures are an annual event at Notre Dame. When others grow weary, you have a responsibility to stay strong. While others may surrender, you must continue to resist. For as the theologian William Stringfellow said in a recent book, the vocation to oppose and transcend the power of death, the calling to live humanly in the midst of death, is unceasing and incessant. That resistance goes on wherever human beings truly esteem the gift of their humanity, which at the same time means wherever human beings esteem the Word of God. Notre Dame was founded and flourishes on the Word of God. And of all the work given to this world and taken up here, none is more important than civil rights. It is, whatever we do to the least of our brethren, it is what we do unto him. Now, it would be proper, I think, and appropriate on this occasion to take as my task the job of looking back over the history of the civil rights movement since the Brown decision, recounting some of the successes and failures and charting where we've been and where we are now and where we might go. In fact, however, I've chosen to broaden that theme and to explore some of the larger implications of the civil rights, human rights situation in the world. And I propose in these lectures to examine first, therefore, the connection between human rights internationally as well as domestically, and second, to look at the distance we've come and how far we've got to go before we sleep. And I take this approach because all of the experiences of my life, especially the recent ones, persuade me that no other approach, let me repeat, no other approach can succeed. Anybody who's lived as I have through the period of legally segregated society in the 30s, let's say, and 40s, and through the dawn of the Enlightenment of the 50s and 60s, and who now witness the Nixon negations, must realize tonight that civil and human rights will not be established or maintained in this land or in the world unless we establish, first of all, an ethical and moral understanding of man, of his nature and his destiny, clear and strong enough to sustain a universal, not only a domestic effort for justice. I assure you that nothing else can succeed. Campaigning, for example, for the vice presidency, to prove to me that only universal values and total honesty can possibly bring the Wallaceites of Alabama together with the liberals on the west side of New York. Visiting the Soviet Union, as I have 10 times in the last 12 months, convinces me that once again, only universal values and total honesty can match the intelligence and the courage of people like Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn, or enable anyone to speak across the seeming void between communism and capitalism. Traveling around the world for the Peace Corps, or confronting want in America during the war against poverty, convinced me once again that only the application of universal values and total honesty can touch the poor and the rich alike, even within our own country. Thus, we must recall, I believe, and remember that what we call civil rights in America is part of a broader category of human rights which must apply everywhere. While it is important to recognize the legitimate distinction between the whole and its American part, at the same time we must see and understand them together. Because first of all, they are philosophically related. Our conception of civil rights flows from a deeper conception about the nature of man and society, which provides the same sources for our conception of human rights. They are politically related. If the United States is to stand as an advocate for human rights abroad, an example, the Jackson Amendment, and I think we must stand for human rights abroad, then we must act for civil rights at home. Finally, these things are problematically related. The most important emerging issues in the world today cut across the traditional distinctions between domestic and foreign policy. Indeed, we now face practical problems of a transnational nature which witness empirically to the truths which poets and philosophers and mystics have been expressing for centuries. The truth about the unity of the human family, its solidarity, and its single destiny. Initially, therefore, I suggest to you that we must establish a framework for the discussion of human and civil rights by examining the problems we face and by probing the philosophic foundations of those problems. Without such philosophic foundations, we cannot deal well or truly with the most important issues of the day. We need to know where we stand intellectually and morally before we can decide where we want to go and how we're going to get there in terms of handling the problems. Now let me say, I think that a lot of that may sound quite abstract. And I've got 30 or 40 pages here to prove to you that it is abstract. But on advice of counsel, seated here on my left, I have decided that it would be just as easy, maybe easier, for you to grasp where I stand on those issues and the philosophy of it by reading what I've written rather than having me preach it to you. And therefore, I'm not going to go ahead and analyze the philosophic foundations or the necessity for those foundations in speaking to you here this evening. Rather, I'm going to diverge from that text and talk to you, rather than lecture to you, about some of my own experiences, which I hope will help you to understand why I think that for the future, for the solution of future problems, we've got to have the kind of philosophic and moral foundation I've described. Let me give you an illustration of what I mean. When President Kennedy called me in Chicago, where I was living, and asked me to come down and run the Peace Corps, I remonstrated with him and said no. I was very happy in Chicago. I was president of the Board of Education, and I suggested he get someone else. And I said there were many people who needed this job. Particularly, there were a lot of political friends of his that deserved it, and he should pay off some of those political debts. And he said to me, "No, Sarge, you've got the whole idea wrong. This is not a political plum. Everybody says it's going to be a fiasco. And if it is a fiasco, it'll be much easier for me to fire a relative than a political friend." So he asked me to come to Washington to at least get the study underway on the basis of which a Peace Corps could be launched. I assembled down there 10 or 20 men and women to help me think how the Peace Corps idea could be carried out. What was the concept, let's say, that we were really trying to demonstrate to the world? How could we express that concept intelligently to Pandit Nehru in India and Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, and to people in the Philippines or in Burma or in South America? It had to be a concept which they could understand and would respond to. It had to have a philosophical aura and reality to it, otherwise they would not be able to comprehend what we were trying to do. In addition, there were the technical problems. So we started working, and we'd start work from 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning to 10, 11 o'clock at night every night. And about every fourth day, President Kennedy would call me and say, "Sarge, when are we going to get the Peace Corps started?" And I'd keep saying to him, "Well, Mr. President, we're coming along. We'll get there soon. We're working on the theory of it." He said, "Working on the theory of it?" He said, it would be easier for me to start a real war with the Defense Department than to get a Peace Corps effort going with you." And I said, "Well, it may just be that ours is harder." But in any event, we spent 30 days, and he must have called 10 times saying, "Why can't we get that Peace Corps started?" The reason we couldn't get it started is the reason I just tried to describe. The reason was that I was unwilling, and the men and women with me were unwilling to start it until we knew why we were doing what we were doing and how we were going to do it. The result of that effort was demonstrated in many ways after we got the Peace Corps going. For example, and this, believe it or not, has got a relation, I think, to civil and human rights. For example, we decided that we would have a selection system not based on the college entrance examination boards, not based on the legal aptitude tests, or any other written test. That we were going to go out and try to get the best people, regardless of race, color, creed, or sex, and that they would be processed through a totally open selection process. We got one of the best people in the United States on selection to run that for us. The result of that was that the very first people, let's say 100, 200 volunteers came into the Peace Corps, were distinguished by the fact that there were plenty of women in the group, plenty of men. There were Chicanos in the group. There were black people in the group. There were Catholics. There were Protestants. There were Jews in the group. It was a heterogeneous group of people without any effort to separate them for any external reasons. I then, at this period, was called before the Senate to discuss the Peace Corps, and I was asked how we were selecting people, and I described it. And one of the senators from this state, incidentally, Senator Capehart, said to me, "Well, how are you going to assign the people overseas?" And I said, "We're going to assign them overseas just the way we're selecting them at home." He said, "Then you will never be able to send any Peace Corps volunteers to a Muslim or Arab country." And I said, "Why not?" "Because they won't let any Jews come in." And in my ignorance and naivete, I said, "Well, I guess then we won't go to any countries like that." And we went on with the discussion. The next morning, I found that on page 1 of the New York Times. That was the most shattering thing that had been said before the Foreign Relations Committee in a decade. The fact is, the record is, that we sent Peace Corps volunteers, including Jews, to Muslim countries. I can remember visiting Golda Meir in Israel after coming from Somalia in Africa and recounting the fact that in this particular Muslim country there was a split-level house there with two families in it. One was a couple in the Peace Corps and the other was a Muslim couple. And the Peace Corps couple were not just Jews, they were Orthodox Jews, and the young husband of the group customarily wore a skull cap, a yarmulke, as the Orthodox frequently do. She was the foreign minister of Israel at the time, and she said, well, Mr. Shriver, that's an interesting story, but of course I can't believe it. And I said, well, Madam Foreign Minister, you're going to have to believe it because you're never going to get permission to go there to find out whether it's true or false. The fact is that the Jewish young men and women were accepted in these countries. And the fact also is that at that time, Father, you may be interested to hear this, I was told that we couldn't send Protestant volunteers to South America to work in isolated towns because the Catholic priests would tell the local people that to speak to a Protestant would endanger them with hell's fire. And therefore the volunteers couldn't be accepted or assigned. And I said to somebody, well, I've been a Catholic all my life, and I've never seen any priest like that. Why don't we just gamble and see what happens? And so once again, in our ignorance, if you will, because this advice we got was not from people standing on the street corner, this was expert advice. We sent Protestants, Catholics, and Jews down to South America just as we did to Arab countries. And sure enough, no Catholic priests threatened their parishioners with hell's fire for talking to Protestant volunteers. In fact, the Protestant volunteers, I'm happy to say, were just as successful in Latin America, maybe more so than the Catholics. One of them went to Chile, where the Notre Dame group was, and we found, an inspector was down there 6 or 8 months later and found this fellow living in the rectory of a local church with the priest. And he said, how'd you get in here? He said, well, there's no place to live in this town. When I got here, I had to find some place to live, and this Catholic priest let me come in and take a spare room there in the rectory, and that's where I'm staying. And the fellow said, you got to get out of there. If the Congress finds out about it, we'll be in violation of the separation of church and state, and the whole program will go up. So about 6 or 8 months later, the same visiting inspector was there and found the fellow still in the rectory with the Catholic priest. And he said, I order you to get out. The fellow said, I'm not leaving. He said, what do you mean you're not leaving? You're jeopardizing the whole program. And the fellow said, well, I don't know, but I'm not leaving. He said, well, why aren't you leaving? He said, well, I'll tell you why. I've been in here now for 6 or 8 months. Everybody in town calls me Padre. And I said I get a 40% discount on everything I buy. Similarly, in hiring people for the staff of OEO, once again, we were too ignorant to know that you couldn't do things. And so we had a woman in charge of hiring everybody. In fact, the talent search head in the Peace Corps in the early days was a woman, believe it or not. One of the people she found out subsequently ended up as the managing editor of Ms. So we had women at the very top of the Peace Corps in the early days. Well, that, it turned out after we had them there, we found out we were the only people that had them at all in the federal government. And we had black people in top jobs. And so at one point I said to myself, again in my ignorance, one of the greatest things to be in Washington is ignorant. And I said, well, now, what we will do is we will have these programs overseas. We will appoint people to run them, like Leverett Saltonstall's cousin, William Saltonstall, who was the head of the Exeter School in New Hampshire, very distinguished, gray-haired, Yankee, rectitude, Harvard type. And we get him, but we'll also get some black people to run our programs in Africa. Whereupon one of the great experts on Africa wrote a story, wrote me a personal letter about it, and said we couldn't do that. And I said, why not? And he said, that will be insulting to the Africans. I said, why? He said, because everyone in Africa knows that black people in America are treated as second-class citizens. So if you send a black person to run a program for the United States government in Africa, they will be insulted because they think you're sending a second-class citizen. I couldn't believe that. It was such a tortured sort of logic that I just didn't believe that black people in Africa were going to react like that, despite what this expert told me. So instead of that, we just sent black people to run the program. One of them, Dr. Sam Proctor, who's now pastor of Adam Clayton Powell's church, Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem, went out there. He was there for 2.5 years, and he had some experiences on the race issue. Number one, he was a great success in the job. But number two, one day, he was getting his shoes shined. And he noticed that a white man had been ahead of him and paid so much, and then a black man had been ahead of him and paid less. And so then he got his shoes shined, and the boy looked up at him and said, charged him the same price as the white guy had been charged. And Dr. Proctor said, well, what do you mean? I just saw this local man getting his shoes shined for half that. He and this young fellow out in Lagos looked up at Dr. Sam Proctor and said, yes, sir, but you're a white man. Dr. Sam Proctor was as black as any of us here tonight. But he found out that over there, he found out over there it wasn't whether you actually were black or white, but it was whether you were an American or not. He was a great success. And then we took a black fella and put him in charge of the program in the Philippines, which was something we weren't supposed to do. And he worked out very well. Again, let me repeat, ignorance was the greatest asset we had in Washington. Now, how did it happen that we did those things? We didn't do them maliciously. We didn't do them because we were out to prove a point. We did them because before we ever started the Peace Corps, we took the time to try and figure out what our philosophy was about the Peace Corps. As some younger people say today, we got our heads screwed on. We screwed it on. We got ourselves organized internally, personally, so that when questions came up, such as Senator Capehart saying, well, you're not going to send Jews to Arab countries, are you? The answer came out spontaneously. Well, of course we are. We didn't have to rush out and wonder if we gave that answer how many votes we would lose in the Senate. When a ticklish question came up about civil rights, we didn't have to go out and take a public opinion poll in the United States to find out what everybody thought we should do before we did what we ourselves knew we ought to do. We just went ahead and did it. And that, again, let me say, took place only because, in my judgment, the people who were running it had their heads screwed on. They knew what they believed in, they lived up to what they believed in, and by doing that, the program itself, strangely enough, was very successful. Now, a similar thing took place with the war against poverty. Lyndon Johnson asked me to take on that job. And again, I said, as I did to Kennedy, I don't really want this job. There's got to be somebody who knows more about it than I do. And he said, you just got to do it. And he said to me something that very few people have ever heard in their lives. Listen, Sarge, we've got $500 million here, and we want you to spend this money to defeat poverty. Well, I mean, who ever heard that before or since? And I said, well, Mr. President, we'll have to get together some people and try to figure out what to do. Who knows how to run against a war, or run a war against poverty? Nobody. And so once again, we went through 30 days and 30 nights of planning and working and studying and sweating and not knowing what we were supposed to do. And then we proposed a program. We got it through the Congress. And one of the things we decided to do in that program was this. We decided, on the basis of research that we knew about, which had taken place in Tennessee, and this research proved that you could take mentally retarded children and improve their IQ by the right kind of diet and instruction, remedial education. we decided that if you can do that with mentally retarded children, you ought to be able to do something reasonably good for regular children who came into classes unprepared or ill-fed or from backgrounds where they were not even prepared in language to speak what was going on in the classroom. And so we started Head Start. Nobody ever told us to do that. But when we did it, in 6 months we had 575,000 children in it, and the Congress saying, thank God you've done this. We've tried for years to get it started, but nobody would give us permission. We couldn't get the Congress to do it. You just went ahead and did it. Why did you do it? And the explanation was so simple, no one would believe it. And then when we found so many children in America getting kicked out of high school, pushed out, we said, let's organize a similar program for high school students. And for the first time in history, before or since, we started a scholarship program where it was necessary as a qualification to have flunked a minimum of 3 courses. If you hadn't flunked 3 courses, been thrown out of high school, you couldn't get one of these scholarships. These people were proven academic failures. They couldn't pass a test to get into any college, let alone Notre Dame or Yale or any other place. And we gave them a remedial training program in the summer, and we got some colleges to go into cahoots with us, and we put these people into college. And as of today, the record of people staying in college and completing college out of the Upward Bound program exceeds the record, percentage-wise, of the people who qualify to get in on the regular entrance test to go to college. Just yesterday, I think, not yesterday, last week, in the front page of the New York Times, they told about CCNY, one of the greatest prestige intellectual colleges in New York City. For 50 years, a center of great Jewish education. Many, many Jewish people went there, terribly bright, very high academic performance. And I think it was about 5 or 6 years ago, Judge Motley would know, they decided to have open enrollment at CCNY. And many people said that that would be the end of academic excellence at CCNY. The program's now been operating for, I think, 5 or 6 years. And the record shows that the people who have gotten into CCNY, despite the fact they had none of the qualifications, according to the entrance tests, have done just as well, and 80% of them have graduated. What does this prove? I think that it proves, in terms of civil rights and human rights, that we think we know a lot more than we do know about how to select among people for advancement in this society, whether it is in the area of education, service abroad, the foreign service, the law schools, the medical schools, or any other type of professional area, or any other area of professional work. Now that's heresy. Today it's heresy. If you go up and say that at the Harvard Law School, you're in trouble. But the fact is, my friends, that we know so little about what makes a success in the law or medicine that we are we're treading on very, very dangerous ground when we decide that we will exclude somebody who's well enough motivated to want to go. A recent study, in fact, showed that the people from the Harvard Law School who ended up making the most money in the law were the people who with the B- and the C averages. Now, there may be a lot of explanations for that, too. But the truth of the matter is that we have got a lot of misconceptions and conceptions in our mind. Things we know are true, which are just, in truth, false. We have a cultural baggage which we carry with us and which we believe is axiomatic in education and in the professions, and it's false. If you don't believe it, You should have come to some of the early meetings of OEO when we had advisory groups drawn, it was said, from the poor. And one of the most ridiculous things in the world, in the opinion of the people who knew everything, was that we were going to ask poor people to advise us on how to deal with the problems of poor people. The cliche was, if they knew anything, they wouldn't be poor. How can they advise you? You must be crazy. The fact is, they gave us the best advice we got from anybody. And a large number of them who were flat broke and who were being discriminated against in a whole host of ways, whether it was in the southwestern part of the United States, the Spanish-speaking people, or up in Harlem, a lot of those people are now big shots. Some of them are professors yet, believe it or not. Bona fide academic professors who were not even able to get through high school. And others of them are on big boards of banks, and they're leaders in community work in Harlem and in other parts of the country. Why? Because they got what we call a human chance. I've been over to Russia, I mentioned here a minute ago, 10 or 12 times in recent years, recent months. And let me tell you something, it's extremely interesting. There's a lot over there that we all dislike. It's an oppressive, drab, stultifying environment. But there's some things there that are quite remarkable to see. Let me give you a couple of illustrations. When you go into the best restaurant in Moscow, or any of the restaurants there, you'll be surprised and impressed by the way people look. They don't look like high society. They don't look all snappy and fixed up. They look like people who earn their living. Workers, believe it or not, you know, workers, regular old workers. And I've been in those restaurants a lot, and we send around and find out where these people come from. And believe it or not, that's exactly what they are. They're workers. Now, it's not glamorous. It's not the Côte d'Azur. It's not Areonassus, etc. But these people are leading a very nice life. And they're nothing but ordinary workers. Or you go into the ministry, where I've been in dozens of them now, and you meet a fella, and I was rather impressed by the man, and I talk about where was he from. This fella was a dock worker on the docks in Murmansk. How did he get here? And then you hear his story. No education. But let me tell you something, very shrewd and very intelligent. Ambassador Vance, when he was negotiating for our country at the peace talks in Paris, you know, our very good friends, we used to talk about the negotiations after they were over every night. I mean, when they negotiated once a week. And I asked him what he thought about the number one man, the number two man, etc. And the great thing to him about Xuan Thuy, who was this deputy head of the mission over there for North Vietnam, was the fact that Xuan Thuy had never gotten beyond the 3rd grade. But Xuan Thuy was every bit the equal intellectually of Cy Vance, who's one of the smartest corporation lawyers in America. With all of the training that Cy Vance had had, he had a tough time dealing with this 3rd grade dropout from North Vietnam. What am I saying by talking about those things? I'm trying to say to you that civil rights and human rights are based on something much more profound than education, race, money, health, clothes, background, or any of the other things that we as a society frequently use to differentiate people and say this one deserves something and that one does not. I think the most important thing that we can do in preparing ourselves to work in civil rights and human rights, therefore, is to do what I started to say at the beginning, and that is to develop each man and woman for himself a philosophy of humanity, an outlook on human beings which gets rid of all of these external indications for differentiation, all of these external excuses for voting you down and you up, and get back to finding out what it is about each one of us which merits the best equitable attention from the bureaucrats, the politicians, the educators, or the big lawyers. To me, that means going back to what you might call the human rights philosophy, which undergirds the Constitution of this country and the Declaration of Independence of this country. Those platitudes, if you will, that all men are created equal, they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. If someone were to write those words today, a huge proportion of the leading scientific minds of the world and the philosophic minds of the world would say, poppycock. There's no God, there's no inalienable rights, there's nothing that distinguishes people from any other type of animate life. We just happen to be here on this little planet. It's just a result of the law of large numbers and probabilities. That's all there is. There's nothing beyond this world. It's an illusion to think that there's any reason for treating people differently than you treat any other object in this world. Thomas Jefferson today would be as out of date intellectually as narrow lapel suits. If that's so, this country's in trouble, and human and civil rights are in trouble in this country. But I don't believe that that reigning utilitarianism or pragmatism, that business that the only thing that is successful is something that works, that seems to produce results right now, that philosophy, I may say, of Oliver Wendell Holmes, Bentham, the people who have had the greatest philosophic impact on this nation since the Revolution, let's say since the 1850s, I don't believe that philosophy is worth a tinker's damn today or for the future. Now let me tell you why. If you haven't read it, go get Sakharov's books. They're all about this thick, thin books. Anybody in this university can read his longest book in an hour. You can spare an hour. Go to the library, get Sakharov's books. Go get Solzhenitsyn's Nobel Prize lecture. It's even shorter. It's not going to put strain on anybody's brain, but read it. And then go get books by Bernard Herring, a priest yet. I'm urging you to read a book by a priest. That's almost heresy, I suppose. Go get a book by Bernard Herring, who of all things, unusual, was the confessor to John the 23rd. I mention that only because I want to get some credentials behind him before I tell you what he says. You go get what he writes. Now in Sakharov, you've got an atheistic, nuclear fusion bomb man who was elected to the Academy of Sciences of the Soviet Union at 32 years of age, which is about 15 years earlier than anybody else has ever been elected. The winner of the Stalin Medal, etc., and the builder of their hydrogen bomb, which incidentally they built before we built one. So this fella has all of the scientific, technological qualifications of anybody, including all the people on the faculty here. Now you read what he says, and you'll find out that what Sakharov says is this, in a nutshell. He says that we must find the ethical, humanistic, moral basis for society, universal, that can be applied to all peoples in all cultures. And you turn around and read Father Bernard Herring and find out what he says. And he says the exact same thing. I tell you, my friends, that there may be an apathetic situation in the United States or worry about civil rights or human rights having lost their appeal to people. God knows, with the leadership we get or lack of it from Washington, it's no surprise that some people are discouraged. But the Nixons and the Brezhnevs, the Pompidoux and the Heaths, all of us are living at a time in world history when the forces that are coming from underneath are going to overwhelm the people who happen to be now on the top. Because what's happening in the most intelligent, profound people inside of Russia and inside the Catholic Church is very simple. They're both realizing that there is nothing in the world as important as a human being, and that human being's dignity, and that human being's rights, and that human being's freedom from government, from bureaucrats, from manipulation, from drugs, from oppression. And these people are the avant-garde. They are the advanced thinkers that all of you will be following, I believe, 10, 15, 20 years from now. And they will help you, and you will help them to create an international, supranational, transnational body of opinion which will once again put civil and human rights first, ahead of national interests, ahead of chauvinistic interests, ahead of money, ahead of any aspect of our life here on this planet that now looms large. I predict that. I am certain it's going to happen. There are things going on in this world much deeper than we read in the paper. And those things are going to lead us, with your help, to a better world and a deeper recognition of the solidarity of the human family and its unique and single destiny as one family under God. Thank you.
Mostly just a matter of curiosity. I'm wondering why you're in Russia so many times in the past year.
That's a good question. No, I've been going out there, thanks. I've been going out there on behalf of certain European and American corporations who are foolish enough to think that I can help them do some business out there. And we haven't done any yet. But that's how I got to go out there. I happened to go out by a chain of circumstances I won't bore you with. I happened to go out there on the initial trip to the Soviet Union in July '72, made by a rather famous, legendary American businessman named Armand Hammer, who's the president of an oil company called Occidental Petroleum. And his father was a Russian. He was born in Russia. It's one of these incredible stories. Did you all ever, anybody here ever hear of him? Yeah. Well, he's an incredible guy. He was out there in the 20s and got to know Lenin pretty well. And he had quite a few letters from Lenin, and Lenin wrote a letter to the people at that time and said, want to introduce my friend Armand Hammer. Do anything you can to help him out. And then several of us had the idea that maybe that was bankable today. I could talk about that at great length. I don't want to dismiss it, but I'd be happy to talk to you about it. It's very interesting. That's what brought me out there.
You don't have great length on your program whether the country or the poor people are any better off today for those programs? We still hear that they don't operate that well. I'm from Chicago. We feel in Chicago that OEO and the deal programs do not operate to the poor people's benefit. Yet you said you got a great deal of advice from them, and what they've done has been left in other people's ear. What do you feel at this time?
Could you hear the question at all? The question was this gentleman is from Chicago, and he commented that I talked at length about OEO and Upward Bound and Head Start and other these programs, yet there's a substantial body of opinion in Chicago and elsewhere that these programs in fact were ineffective, that very little help, I guess you might say, or assistance got to the poor, that I claim we had advisors who were poor but didn't seem to help the programs any. I guess the gist of it is that he phrased it, how do I feel about that? Namely that there's so much expert opinion, let's just say, that the programs weren't very good, right? Is that fair? Summary?
Let me rephrase the last part. I know that you did a great deal of work with the people who tried doing these programs, and other people are in charge of them now.
Oh.
There are a good deal of people who feel that they're not benefiting the poor people, and they never did from the start. You've had time to reflect on that since you've been out of the program, and you have a new opinion on it at this time.
Oh, he's saying, in addition to what I did say, he's saying that other people have been running these programs for quite a while, and have I had a chance to reflect, and do I think that those programs were good, or should they be modified or eliminated and so on? Okay? Well, first of all, let me say that by talking about some of those programs, I don't mean to imply that any of those programs was sufficiently large, adequately financed, or continued long enough to actually achieve the results for which they were intended to achieve. For example, if you get a fellow who's flunked out of high school and getting through college, and you do that for one fellow, you've just got to continue to do that for the people who come along behind him. Otherwise, if the program stops after 4 or 5 years, you can't say that it's continuing to do any good. If you put a child into Head Start and give it a Head Start, you can't stop. You've got to continue to reinforce and maintain that kid. It's almost like saying, you know, I gave you vitamins for a whole year when you were 8. Now you're 10 and I don't see any results of those vitamins. You've got to continue to give people vitamins. And what happened was that the vitamin supply got knocked off. We found it possible in this country to supply all the bombs and bullets and et cetera that we needed in Vietnam. But we didn't find it possible to supply all of the vitamins we needed in a war against poverty. The fact is, when we started it, the first year, 1965, we submitted a budget to the president that said we could get rid of poverty, as it was then defined, by 1976. But it would cost about $15 billion a year to do that. We had 2, and they stopped it at that level, never therefore adequately financed it, and then said it's a failure. It's just as if they had sent General Westmoreland out there and said, you got 40,000 troops, and he said, I can't do it without 400,000, and then he was a failure, and they said that proves that it wasn't any good. In fact, the war against poverty, with all of its weaknesses and with its strengths, couldn't possibly have succeeded in the time span it was given and at the level it was financed. It absolutely impossible. So looking back, I am very sorry. Number one, that we weren't brighter and didn't have even better programs. Number two, we weren't able to get the money. Number three, that they weren't continued. So how do I look on it? I look back on it with sadness. Not that we did anything wrong. Not that our purposes were bad. Not that we wasted money. Let me tell you something. I will stack our record for not wasting money up against anything going on in this administration today, including all the work of Mr. Weinberger. Yes, sir.
Sir, you alluded earlier in your special action, you spoke about it, that in selecting members of the Peace Corps and the War Department, you really didn't look for qualifications. And I think implicit in that is the idea that it's not necessary perhaps for kitchen requirements for occupations and etc. We're here commemorating conference today, commemorating the 20th anniversary of Brown, a decision which opened up schools to minority people. Before the Supreme Court now is a case which may very well be the Brown of the 70s, and that's the Peters case. And I'm wondering with your remarks here tonight, and your position as a lawyer, what is your opinion in terms of that case before the Supreme Court, and how do you see the outcome of that case?
A question has to do with the case that the Supreme Court heard arguments on a couple of weeks ago, the DeFunis case. And the question is, what do I think about that case from a point of view of a lawyer? How will it work out? And in view of the things I said earlier this evening, do I think it's significant whether or not people get access to education? I assume that's part of the question, right? Well, it's a dangerous thing, as all lawyers know, to stick your neck out and indicate how you think the Supreme Court's going to rule on anything. If everybody who has any contact with the Supreme Court, certainly in Washington, knows that nobody ever predicts how the Supreme Court's going to vote. However, having said that, I will tell you what I think. It appears, I would say, that it's going to be a very close decision. The best people that I know think that there's probably 3 votes on that court right now in favor of the DeFunis side of the argument. On the other side, it's thought down in Washington it's probably 4 votes on that court in favor of the University of Washington and the procedures it followed. And there's 2 hanging in there loose that nobody knows exactly how they're going to go. The 2 that are hanging in there loose, some people think will come down on the side saying it's a moot case. Since DeFunis did get into law school and DeFunis has graduated, there is no justiciable issue left. And if those 2 decide it that way, by the way the court's rules operate, that will be the decision. The 4 who are in favor of the University of Washington, the 3 who are opposed to it, they will be canceled out by the 2 who say it's moot. And the current thinking down in Washington is that that might be the way it'll come out. If you want to know what I think the University of Washington was right. And I think that it's perfectly legitimate to take into consideration for entrance to law school or medical school or Notre Dame or the federal bureaucracy or any place else, a whole variety of considerations in selecting people to go to the school. What I tried to emphasize in my talk was that there is no single system. There isn't even a combination of systems which we can prove to you tonight will actually work effectively all the time in picking people for these jobs. There is much more in a human being than can be analyzed by a computer or by a test. There's too many imponderables, too many motivational issues or aspects, too many emotional things, psychological, if you will, which it is almost impossible to predict in education so accurately as to say somebody shall not be permitted to go to law school because they don't pass this particular test. I don't know about the provost's experience, but my experience is that I was at Yale for 7 years. I stayed there for 3 in the law school. It didn't take me 7 to get through the college. But I defy anybody who was there in the classes when I was there to be able to say today that, oh, they knew that so-and-so was going to be a great success in that class. In fact, it's rather appalling that most of the people you thought were going to be, quote, successes didn't turn out so well. And a lot of people who everybody was convinced were going to be failures were fantastic successes. The president of Yale, his name was Whit Griswold, about, I don't know, 15 years ago, I talked to him about that. I said, why is it that all these people get exposed to the same education at this institution or at Notre Dame? Why is it that it seems to take on some of them, it doesn't on others? Why is it that all these people from fine backgrounds get all this education and it just doesn't work on a lot of these people? And I remember him telling me, he said, the day you find the answer to that, you'll have an answer that nobody in education has ever been able to find out. It's spooky. You're the provost, Father. What's the answer? No, but seriously. I really think it is spooky. It's just that simple. It's spooky. I'll bet you went to Notre Dame, didn't you, Father? 4 years. Well, I'm going to make a bet. I'm going to make a bet that he would agree that in his class at Notre Dame, some of the people that he thought were going to turn out to be very, very, I keep using the word successful for want of a better word, did actually, quote, succeed. That a substantial number he thought were going to be exceptionally brilliant or qualified did not. And that another proportion of people that he was sure would not have. Tell me I'm wrong.
Professor Beatty succeeded.
Yes. Do I think that the Civil Rights Commission will address itself to the rights of the fetus? Is that the question? Howard, you can answer that better than I can.
Well, the commission hasn't done that so far. Whether it will in some future time, I don't know. They probably could within the jurisdiction of the commission, but they haven't done that up until this point.
The answer is that, of course, the commission has not yet done so, but Howard says that he thinks that it would be within the would likely be within the jurisdiction of the commission and that it might do so.
Would you comment on who the two swing votes might be on the...
Well, they're alleged to be. They're alleged to be Justice Brennan and Justice Stewart. Yeah.
Had a very strong record for executive action. And since that time, many people that were identified with those administrations, people like Schlesinger and Goodwin, are now writing as if they think the day of strong executive action is over. And that indeed, your remarks tonight seem to point to the fact that you think that it's time to move back to much more fundamental philosophical reflection rather than seeing executive leadership. I'm interested in terms of that kind of background, whether you think in terms of problems of human and civil rights, that one of the things that we discovered is simply that executive leadership is not sufficient to deal with problems.
I think you could all hear the question, could you? No? Well, it's going to be difficult for me to paraphrase a question from a brilliant professor who just posed it, but let me try simply by saying that I was in Washington in 2 administrations, he says, which were characterized by very strong executive leadership. Nowadays, some of the people who were in those administrations, and he cites Arthur Schlesinger Jr. and Ken Galbraith, are what? Richard Goodwin, are writing that to the effect that we probably ought to have a swing away from strong executive leadership. And third, he says that my remark carried the implication, at least, that I too might think that the time when executive leadership can solve some of these profound problems is past, and that we ought to be thinking about the philosophical aspects of these problems rather than trying to solve them by executive leadership. Is that right?
Yeah.
Well, it's a tough question, but let me say, I don't think it is a question of either or. I happen to believe that the best executive leadership comes out of people who have already gotten themselves together philosophically and therefore can move on practical problems from a philosophical understanding of the problem as well as from a point of view of just practical politics, let's say. So that I think the best executives, the kind of executives we ought to have, are executives who, I used that sort of cliche a couple times, that have got themselves gathered together as human beings. They know what they're doing because of their own convictions and don't have to wait and rely on what a public opinion poll, for example, should tell them. And I think there is room for that kind of executive leadership. And tomorrow I hope I'll talk about that a bit. But I also say, sort of repetitiously I'm afraid here, that I think one has to have a philosophy on the basis of which you're operating.
But one of the things you said was that we are dominated today by, as you characterized, very strong utilitarian assumptions about the nature of our relationship
Yes.
with one another. And that one of the things that I heard you saying was that you think that the new strong person, whoever it should be, should not represent that particular philosophical tradition. Therefore, what you are suggesting is that somehow we could have a president in this country that might have a philosophical disposition that is different from the major philosophical disposition of the country, and that I suspect that's impossible.
I agree with you that it's going to require a change in the major philosophical predisposition of the country. And that's why I'm happy to be speaking at a place like this where that kind of change can be helped to be brought about. To achieve what you're right if you can't change the major philosophical cast of mind of the American people. But I'm saying that that's happening underneath, that that's not going to come from the top down, but there's going to be a change. And I think the young people of America are more ready for that than people of my generation, by far. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Mr. Shriver, do you think we can ever realize a fair degree of full civil rights until the poor people, I'm thinking about the parents of poor people, are placed in a position where they can have more of a say in determining the education of their children? Under the present system, practically all poor people must send their children to the local public school, since the cost of sending them to private school or exercising a freedom of choice in that is being priced out of the pocket of an average person. Do you think we can ever really realize full human and civil rights of parents until we get a change in our educational system which will permit the parents to make a choice, permit them to have enough sufficient money so that they can make a choice on how they want their children educated?
No, I agree with you. Go back to my Russian friend Sakharov. He says one of the four principal dangers in the world today is what he calls authoritarianism in education. So you and he, communist and you'd get along very well on that point.
Thank you again, Mr. Shriver, on behalf of all of us. I'd just like to say in conclusion that the second and final lecture in this series will be delivered tomorrow at 3:30 p.m. in this same auditorium. I would also like to remind you that we will be continuing the Civil Rights Conference here again in this auditorium tomorrow morning with a panel of distinguished individuals. We'll be discussing the current crisis and current situation that exists with respect to public education in this country. Also, I would like to remind you that tomorrow evening at 8:45 p.m. we will dedicate the new Civil Rights Center in the law school, and everyone is invited to attend that. Both Father Hesburgh and the Honorable Arthur Goldberg will speak. It will be in the law school library. And finally, on behalf of the law school and the Center for Civil Rights, we'd like to extend a cordial invitation to all of you to attend a reception, an informal reception in the law school lounge, starting immediately after our adjournment here. And I'd like to thank all of you for coming, and good night.